Today we're going to be covering tasks 11, 12, 13, and 14. I got some videos in per your request that hopefully make it a little bit more interesting and help you guys understand some things a little bit better. Issue departure instructions or departure restrictions, clearance void times, hold for release times, and release times. This is mostly going to affect us with Joshua approach operations, but you're going to see some with sport as well. I'll pull up the 2515. The difference between Joshua approach is broken down to multiple sectors. Up here, anything that's going to be north of basically the extended center line of runway 23. Everything very much north of that, or north of Roseman Airport, is going to be Isabella sector. During low traffic times, they combine Isabella with Antelope sector, and it's all one sector. But during higher traffic times or towards the middle of the day, they're going to decombine those positions, and then you're going to have Antelope down to the south, and then up to the north, you're going to have Isabella sector. And that's important for aircraft that are heading southbound. You want to transfer them to the appropriate frequency as the ones that are going to be off the departure end or northbound, which frequency you're going to give them to. That brings us to oceanic clearances. When we must get oceanic flights, we have to do it 15 minutes, no earlier than 15 minutes prior to departure. And I'll show you the diagram for that. For oceanic flights, this is the Atlantic. I couldn't find one for the Pacific, but for the Atlantic, different sections. So they have Nat A, Nat B, C, D, E, and F. Certain ones are going one direction. So ones are going to be going eastbound, and the other ones are going to be going westbound. And they have altitudes that are set at different points along the way, whether you're heading east or westbound, and then also multiple aircraft. So basically, once one goes in, because there's not going to be radar coverage completely over the ocean. So once one aircraft enters that corridor at that set altitude, that is their altitude across, just in case there could be radio issues, because there probably is going to be radio issues. I believe there's even sections where there's radio communication is not able to happen, depending on what's going on and how far away they are from any other radar site or any other transmitter site. But that's why they give specific times, and that's why they don't do it any earlier than 15 minutes, just to ensure they get departure at the right exact time, and then really get into these corridors when they're supposed to. Describe the following: hold for release, EDCT times, and CFR. Hold for release, instructions must be used when necessary to inform a pilot or a controller that a departure clearance is not valid until additional instructions are received. There could be some sort of ground stop someplace, or there could be airspace that's being held for a certain reason, so that's going to be a hold for release. And that's going to happen when you call Joshua approach and request to climb out and release. Joshua approach might say hold for release. They may or may not tell you why or how long it's going to be. The edict times, expect departure clearance times, are assigned through traffic management programs, excluding overriding call for release operations as described in subparagraph E. I'm just reading the definition here. So basically what an edict time is, if you have a hold for release, you might get an edict time say, hey, look, you can expect to depart at this time. Or because of flow at major airports like McCarran or LAX, there might be flow, which means you have to be scheduled to come in at a certain exact time. And they know based off your departure point and your arrival point how long it's going to take to get there on your requested speed. And so they're going to give you an edict time saying this is the time you can expect to depart. And then you have a certain amount of time that you have to be ready to depart within 5 minutes before or after that edict time. That's when you have to go. Otherwise, it's no good, and you have to get a new time. Call for release. Call for release is going to be something that we can expect to do if Joshua Approach has the airspace and they're controlling the 2515. Sport's not open yet. They're going to be driving airliners over our airspace above 6,000 feet because it's always active 6,000 and below. So they're going to be driving airliners through, or other aircraft that are requesting a more expeditious departure route. I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer, but if you look down to the southeast of the airspace down here, they'd have to go all the way around the 2515 just to go northbound. However, if they can cut across the 2515, that saves them a lot of time. But if we have a departure and they're requesting access to the 2515, usually it's the first departure of the day, and they have somebody in our airspace, They might say call for release and give us our clearance when they taxi out. And then when that guy gets up number one for ready for departure, we have to request release from Joshua, and they may give us a restriction. They may just release him if that aircraft was no longer a factor, or if it is a factor, they may say, tell that aircraft he's cleared in the 2515 at or below 15,000 feet if the aircraft they are working is above 16. And that's how they're able to work VFR aircraft in the 2515 with IFR aircraft that are at higher altitudes. So now we're going to go into traffic patterns, task 12. There's lots of things that it wants you to do to define all the traffic patterns. I'm not going to go through all of our traffic patterns, but I will explain some of the conflict points, explain a little bit of the traffic patterns, some key things about certain traffic patterns, things that we need to know about. And then I'm also going to pull up the AIM and talk about how aircraft are supposed to enter a traffic pattern. We'll do that first. So this is the AIM. And in the AIM, it talks about entering the traffic pattern in a level flight, which means at pattern altitude, being midpoint of the runway at pattern altitude, and instead of 45-degree angle. You can see how it comes in here. In entry number 1, that's how they want pilots to enter the pattern. They're going to enter the downwind, and then they're going to go to the base leg, and then or the approach end, and then the base leg, and then on final. Same thing with departure. It specifies that you don't want to do a departure except for a quarter mile from the runway. Let's see here. Oh, it talks about commence a turn to the crosswind leg beyond the departure end of the runway or within 300 feet of the pattern altitude. And 300 feet within the pattern altitude. So basically what they want you to do is they want you to go beyond the departure end, because any other aircraft that are going to be coming inbound to the pattern, they should be entering at a 45 degree prior to the departure end. That way you're beyond that point, you're able to see any traffic, because this is what's going to happen also at uncontrolled airfields where there is no air traffic controller giving them traffic advisories. They want to have these good methods in place, so they're going to go beyond the departure end, they're going to make that crosswind turn, they're going to be looking up, and they want to do it at pattern altitude so you can see aircraft around you. Also, so that if you have aircraft that are helicopters coming in or fighter jet aircraft, they're going to be at different altitudes. So they want you to be at your pattern altitude when you're turning in so that you can see traffic that's going to be potentially a factor for you. Now I'll pull up our traffic patterns here. All right, our traffic patterns, you can tell this is a pretty busy map. You can find this map in the LAK. But we have to the north here, we have the tower flyby pattern at 3,500. It's that altitude for a reason. That's going to be altitude that keeps them below the north reentry. So you can actually have simultaneous north reentry with tower flyby pattern active at the same time. You have to be careful though, because aircraft that request the tower flyby pattern sometimes request a north reentry for the flyby. And if you approve that, just saying approved as requested or make right turnout, the conflict you have is the fact that now they can go up to 4,300, and they might go up to 4,300. Some pilots who aren't super familiar with Edwards may associate the north reentry and the flyby being the exact same thing, other than the fact they're going to be intersecting the flyby line on final. So it's something you need to make sure of if you're approving an aircraft on a right-hand turnout for a north reentry for the flyby line, that they're at a certain altitude, or that you give them unable north reentry, make right turnout for the flyby pattern, 3,500 pattern altitude. You want to specify something like that if you're at all unsure. That way there's no possibility for confusion. What's important to note about the north reentry and the flyby line, if you watch it up here to the north, you can actually see it goes beyond north base, so it's outside of north base. That's important because if we have UAS operations going on, it's going to be covering this north lake bed area. It shouldn't be a factor, although their base leg turn is going to be a factor, and so you need them to make a wider base. Sometimes it helps just tell them to turn base abeam the TACAN. You can see it farther out here. It's going to be way outside the UAS work area. You can see that there's two lines here. There's this red line that goes out here for the flyby pattern, and then a farther one that goes out here. That farther one is mostly going to be used by T-38s when they exceed 350 knots. When they go above 350 knots, it takes longer for them to get that rollout turn, especially in the summer. So they're going to want to go out even farther, so they have that time and they want to get that speed up so they can hit that point where they're trying to get over here past Lakebed 30 so they can get the certain speed they need at the altitude that they need for their testing. To the south, you can see how we have extended turns here to the south for the south reentry, 4,300. What's important to note for the south reentry is a beam that you see off the end of Lakebed 30 It says in the 13204 that right then they're going to descend in pattern altitude. So heavy aircraft and C-12s should be descending to 3,300, and then fighter jet aircraft should be descending to 3,800. If you see them go above 4,500 or stay at 4,300, they might be requesting to go beyond the TACAN, and that's when we need to ask them, hey, what's your plans? What are your intentions? How can we help you? So that covers most of our patterns, except for the initial pattern. The overhead pattern is unique at Edwards, and you'll be able to see why when we talk about SFOs and lifting bodies. I think I have the lifting body pulled up here. Nope, I don't have the lifting body. So lifting body, what's unique about Edwards is that there's going to be high approaches, straightened SFOs, lifting bodies, and shuttle approaches. All of them are going to come down final, and they're going to be descending through 12,000 feet, 9 to 12,000 feet at East Lake Shore, and they're going to be coming down final. And we have so many of them, and so because of that, they decided to make an offset initial pattern for Edwards Air Force Base. You can see how it says up here for the mines, 4,500 MSL to the TACAN, and then from the TACAN inbound, they're going to be north of the extended center line. You can see the center line here is in green, and the other green line above it is going to be north. It should be halfway between runway 23 left and 23 right, which is not much space, but what that does allow is for aircraft coming from high key to descend down final, and for guys that are going at initial, for them not to be at the same place at the same time, because neither aircraft will be able to see each other. The aircraft that are doing the SFOs, the straightened SFOs, and the shuttle approaches are going to be going about 350 knots, 300 knots on final, and guys are supposed to be at initial around 250. So that means that they're going to be going faster than the aircraft at initial, and if they were at over the same point in time, they would not be able to see the aircraft. In the future, if I can find a video that shows the close call we had at Edwards once when an F-35 was not offsetting, then I'll put that in here later. But just to note, that's why we have an offset initial, and that's why it's really critical that any non-base assigned aircraft that come to Edwards and are unfamiliar requesting the initial pattern, you got to verify that they understand that it's offset to the north. It may not be a factor for the time that you have if you don't have an SFO in your pattern at the time. However, if they're going to come here and fly here for the rest of the week and they come back in later on, I've seen it before where the aircraft were unfamiliar with that. They come here to fly, nobody corrects them on the initial contact. The next time they go fly the next day or later that day, they wind up not offsetting and we have a major issue. So it's important to always ensure that non-base assigned aircraft are familiar with our initial pattern and then verify via the rehost whether or not they are north of the center line. All right, now we're going to get down to task 13, SFOs. So for SFOs, we're going to define SFOs, talk a little bit about SFOs, and then I'm going to show you some videos. A flame-out pattern, that's going to be their first definition we're going to talk about. It's an approach normally conducted by a single-engine military aircraft experiencing loss or anticipating loss of engine power or control. What this doesn't say is that it's not just military aircraft. It's military aircraft for us, but it's also done by any single-engine aircraft. Two-engine aircraft or two or more engine aircraft do not practice simulated flameouts or flameout approaches, because if they only lose one engine, or if it's like a buff and it loses like two, then it still has the ability, it has to have the ability before they make that aircraft. We'll just use an example of a twin-engine aircraft. A twin-engine aircraft, the engine has to be certified to be able to operate that aircraft to a certain degree if it loses the first engine. And so they're certified to do that. And so they don't have to practice those approaches because the likelihood they're going to lose both engines is not very high. But single engine aircraft only have the one, and the likelihood that they lose that one, although not necessarily common, it's going to be more common if they're going to have an emergency and they need to practice how to land dead stick or without the engine power. Simulated flameout is a practice approach by a jet aircraft or single engine aircraft at idle thrust to a runway. What that means is the aircraft is not going to turn its engines off to simulate a flameout approach. What they're going to do is they're going to turn their aircraft engines to idle or just above idle depending on the airframe and what the requirements are for that. And then they're going to be hand on that throttle waiting to see if they have to do some sort of thing to adjust it or correct it, especially if they're having a student pilot. I'll show you some videos later on with some students flying SFOs. They're doing it in prop aircraft, but it doesn't matter. Any single engine aircraft needs to practice this approach. And then a flame out is an emergency condition caused by a loss of engine power. It's really important. You're going to notice later on in these videos I show you how crazy it is for an aircraft when they lose their engine, all forward thrust, how much it affects the aircraft and how quickly it affects the airframe. Weather conditions that have to exist for a SFO approach, they need to have 1,000 foot above the highest part of the pattern being flown. Commonly for us, our weather, what's really unique is the weather is being reported in AGL, but we're using MSL for all flights. That means that you need to convert that MSL to AGL. And because of our field elevation is 2311, it's really easy just to add 1,000 feet to whatever we're showing. If we're showing the ceiling at being 10,000 feet on our AFAS machine, then we're going to say, okay, that means that the highest pattern altitude could be flown is 11,000 feet. And so we'll tell the aircraft to report high key at 11,000. Sometimes they'll show a ceiling that is at like 8,000 or 6,000 feet, but we can see above the tower that it's clear skies above the tower. That just means that there is enough significant amount of clouds that they call it a ceiling because it's in all quadrants of our area. However, it doesn't mean that the aircraft should necessarily be capped in a way in which if they can see the runway, that's the biggest deal for why we have the ceiling requirements, is so aircraft can see the runway throughout the entirety of their approach. For an SFO, it is critical that they see the runway, the landing surface. Otherwise, they can get, for instance, if the ceiling was only like 500 feet and the pilot says he can still see the runway, it might get a little bit more scary for them because by the time they're going through the cloud layer at 500 to 1,000 feet off the ground, they don't have time to adjust at their engine power being what it is before it becomes a critical situation. So now I'll show you some videos that I pulled up here. I'll link these also in the description below the actual video when I post it. But just sit back and just watch these, listen to what they're saying. I might pause it and kind of emphasize on some things, but just watch.
Beautiful. Leeway traffic, Cherokee on the upwind, runway 24. I'm going to do a simulated engine out procedure landing on runway 6, Lake Wales. Okay, so we'll get to 1,000 feet. Let's do that little manoeuvre. Okay. And that was nailed. Thank you. That was absolutely bang on the numbers. Alright, so you're flying straight out to 1,000? Straight out to 1,000. I've lost my engine. I'm immediately turning. I'm going to maintain 73 knots. Lake Wales traffic, Cherokee, turning back to land on runway 6, Lake Wales.
I'm going to pause it right here. The important thing to note is he said he's going to maintain 73 knots. The only way to maintain airspeed when you have an engine out or the engine's at idle is to tip your nose down so you're losing altitude and gaining airspeed. So it's what they're doing is a fine line. They're pointing the aircraft and they're skirting that stall speed or above the stall speed because they don't want to get to the stall speed. The aircraft fall out of the air. You'll see a video that shows that later on. But that's really important. What they're really practicing is trying to make sure that they can keep the airspeed that they need, covering the distance that they need with the altitude that they have to land and make it to the runway.
Way down there. 800 feet. Let's see if we can make it. We maintain a nice glide speed. You can see we're gliding in really nicely towards this runway now. Now you've got to remember we do have a tailwind. I bring my flaps in. And keep my nose pointing down towards the runway. Keep it back. Left down 114, so. You can see now that we're getting lower. I've still got that nose pointing down towards the runway. My airspeed's bleeding off. And we're coming in at a really nice 70 knots, which is perfect. Anticipate floating.
You notice right here how much he's moving his stick. He's moving left and right. He's trying to compensate, keep the airplane as level as possible because without the engine providing propulsion and forward airspeed, also he has a tailwind, which means his stall speed is going to be greater. So he has to keep even higher speed than normal. That's a problem with making that 180-degree turn. and coming back to the runway, especially because whatever runway orientation you intended to land on initially, you're on the go now, and that meant that probably was a decent headwind enough to make it so that had to be the required runway. So Edwards, if we have a 20 knot headwind when they're on final, if they try to do a maneuver like this and then make a 180 and try to make it back to the runway, they now have a 20 knot tailwind, and they need to increase their speed even greater. So they'll be landing at a much greater speed than they're used to. So a lot of things have to go into that. And then the controls, you can see how much he has to move his controls. Without that forward airspeed over the aircraft, it's a lot more finicky and a lot more unstable.
Tailwind, we'll just hold it. Let it come in nicely. Welcome to the ground. That was sweet.
And this guy's an instructor, so obviously it's a lot better for him.
If you have an engine failure immediately after takeoff, don't attempt to turn back to the runway. Your chances of making a 180-degree turn with a dead engine while in a climbing attitude at a slow airspeed are not good. Instead, get the nose down quickly, maintain flying speed, and make the best landing you can under the circumstances. Your instructor will simulate engine failures at cruise altitude. As always, your first concern should be to fly the airplane and establish the best glide speed. After you've done this, look for a suitable landing field. The goal of any forced landing is to complete.
So this brings up a good point as far as Edwards, why aircraft depart and they practice lake bed landings. Let me see if I can pull up our spin areas. Hopefully this has it. So you can see when you depart runway 23, you'll have guys often want to depart and make a left-hand turn, low approach, lake bed runway 9. Lake bed runway 9's out here. Just like that instructor just said, it is not a good idea if you don't have altitude to try to make a 180 and get back to the runway. The first video we watched, they only had 1,000 feet of altitude. In their 180-degree turn, they lost 400 feet in that turn. So they lost almost half their altitude. And that's in a more stable aircraft than an F-16. An F-16 is purposely meant and designed, fighter jet aircraft are designed to be unstable so that they can be highly maneuverable because they count on always having propulsion. So when they don't have propulsion, it gets a little bit more hairy for them. So when they're departing the runway, if you can see my cursor, instead of making that 180-degree turn and trying to get back to the runway, they're going to make a maybe 90-degree turn, maybe a little more than a 90-degree turn, and they're going to try and land on lake bed runway 9. That's why only our single-engine aircraft practice that approach, the simulated approach to lake bed runway 9. And that's why it's critical that if we can improve it, we need to try to give it to them as much as possible. It also brings up a point with this lake bed spin shown right here of modified SFOs. Sometimes aircraft will request to do an SFO, but the lake bed spin's active. Lake bed spin starts at 6,000 feet. That's not a lot of altitude for most of our heavy fighter type aircraft, but it might be okay for smaller single engine aircraft that we might have. Some of you know that we get some aircraft from other bases that come here with single engines, and they want like the L-39, and they want to practice single engine approaches, but only at 7,000 feet. We can offer them at 5,500 because that gets us below the lake bed spin altitude. Same thing with guys who want to do a left turnout for low key, or they want to do a right turnout for an SFO. We can offer them, if they're able to make a left turnout to low key at or below 5,500, then they might be able to do that. And if we could offer that to them, sometimes they're really grateful to have that approach because they can still count it as a simulated engine out. And single engine aircraft commanders have to do a certain amount of single engine or of simulated engine failure landings per quarter or however much that their timeline is for that. But that is a requirement for them. So as long as we can, or as often as we can, we need to try to accommodate that. All right, I got another one here for you. This is another instructor, a really good way to see how much it affects the aircraft when they lose their engine.
Show you guys a simulated engine failure on takeoff. When's the last time you're rolling down the runway, you get to 200-300 feet, and the instructor pulls the throttle back to idle? This is such a vital skill to have and know how to do. Flying Tiger traffic, Skyhawk 715, Quebec, departing runway 27, Flying Tiger. Easy to do a nice uncontrolled, pilot-controlled airport like this as well. With a towered airport, you need a little bit more permission. We go full power. Airspeeds, we say, is alive. Engine gauges in the green. Everything's looking good. And we think to ourselves, it's going to be a nice, easy, just normal takeoff. And we rotate. And we climb up, up, up. And all of a sudden, without any warning, The engine quits. Look how fast we have to push that nose forward. Look how quick that ground comes. Listen to that stall warning horn coming on. We have to hold it off, and put it back down. Guys, watch that again. Watch how fast everything happens. Listen to the moment the engine quits, how quickly and how quickly that stall warning horn comes on, how quickly we have to push that nose over to keep this airplane flying. There was no time to add flaps. All I could think about, all I had time for was to nose that airplane forward. That's all I had time to do and make a normal landing. And now it becomes a no flap landing, and it happens so very quickly.
What he mentioned there was a no flap landing. We also get this with aircraft requesting no flaps, or they may not tell you, and they're actually flying faster down final than you expect, especially in a T-38. And you might ask, or I've seen it in tankers too, you might ask, why is this guy flying so fast? He's probably doing a no flap landing. Pilots should request this, but it means they're probably going to be, depending on the airframe, they could be anywhere from 15 to 25, 30 knots faster on final, which is a big deal for us depending on the airframe. And so pilots should request it, but they don't often request it. The other thing to note here, too, is you saw that he taxied into the underrun to do this departure, to show you this. Now, he's showing this on purpose, that he has enough runway to land. However, you'll get frustrated sometimes why guys want to back taxi on runway 23 right for departure, especially T-38s, and you think, why? You're only gaining like maybe 500 feet. Well, this is why. In case that there is a situation where they lose an engine, especially even if it's a twin-engine aircraft, if it's a T-38 on a hot day in the summer, they're going to want more runway than not, because it's going to take longer to get the amount of speed that they need to get airborne. And so runway behind them is not useful runway, only runway in front of them.
Which you need to be ready for. So listen, let's show it to you guys again now. Let's do a simulated engine failure on takeoff, but let's assume we don't have any usable runway available. What do we do next? All right, let's say now we go full power. Again, engine gauges are all green, airspeed's coming alive, everything's looking great, everything's set. We're rolling down the runway. We rotate. We get past the point of where our engine failed last time. We just keep on climbing out. You can see there's not a whole lot around me other than trees and everything else. And what if my engine were to fail when I don't have usable runway left? When do I run out of usable runway? I'd say about now I'm out of usable runway. And yeah, there's runway in front of me, but for me to get down and stopped in time, it's going to take some pretty superior skills to certainly make that happen. I'm passing through 300 feet. Let's say I get up here. Let's get to 500 feet. And watch what happens. We'll simulate this. Watch what happens at 500 feet. My engine quits again. Power comes back to idle. Look, startle response. 1, 2. Look how fast I'm coming down here. I've got one option, and it's this field in front of me. And I better make that happen. That is my one and only option to make that happen. I'm going around just to be safe here. But that is my one and only option to make that happen. There's no time to make that turn back. My rule of thumb is if I'm 1,000 feet or less, I'm not attempting to turn back to the runway. It's called the impossible turn for a reason, and I don't want to tempt fate with that. You saw how quickly the airplane dropped, how quickly I had to push that nose down to keep the airplane flying. That was at 500 feet. By the time I was ready to go around, I was at 400 feet. Just in that 10 seconds of talking to you guys, there isn't enough time to turn around.
This brings up a really good point. I have seen it happen at Edwards, where we had an aircraft. Let's see if I can pull up our local area here. I'll just use this. So we had an aircraft. It was Extra 300 departed, and you could watch when he departs. He does 2-3 right at Bravo, so he is taking a risk of having not enough runway ahead of him. However, his aircraft characteristics, unlike that Cessna 172 we were just watching, says that he can get airspeed and he can get altitude quick. Huge climb rate in an Extra 300. It's an aerobatic airplane, so he gets airborne, and you can see the first thing he does is get as much altitude as he possibly can. And one day at Edwards, he got as much altitude as he could, requested that early right turnout. I gave it to him, or my trainee gave it to him. He started to make a right-hand turnout, and he keyed up and said, "Tower, we lost our engine. We're coming to land runway 6, or correction, runway 5 now." And so I took over immediately and said, "Roger, runway 5, clear to land." And he made that impossible turn, but he had so much altitude, and already he was probably at least 1,000 to 1,500 feet on that right-hand turnout. He made it back enough time to land on the runway, but it happened quick. I mean, instantaneously. That's why we had to make sure that we're paying attention and being really good at our job, because in a moment's notice, something like that can happen, and we have to be able to do something about it. It could have been way worse if we had, say, a C-12. We lined up a C-12 behind him on that runway at the approach end, and the aircraft took the runway for departure. We would have to act fast. We might have to say, cancel departure clearance, exit runway at taxiway Charlie, emergency aircraft coming in to land. We might have to be quick on that. That's not something that you're going to practice saying, because you don't anticipate that happening all the time. But what you have to do, especially with single-engine aircraft, is you have to be able to anticipate things that you might be able to do to help give them outs, or what we can do to mitigate problems or issues. We don't always necessarily have the time to anticipate an engine going out in any of our aircraft at any time. However, it's something that we need to consider, and the best thing to do is to do something. You can't not act in situations like that. That also brings up the point, this guy even mentioned too, that 500 feet to 1,000 feet was areas in which there are no-go areas for him. Our Cessnas fly around in our pattern all the time at 500 feet. That means that they don't have a lot of time to be able to react if they lose an engine. We need to consider that whenever we're working Cessnas at South Base. And if we can, give them higher altitudes when we can. Our departures for South Base, or any of our departures, if they're going to go via Lancaster to the south, Buckhorn off the departure end, or if they're going to go to Roseman, as soon as we can, we should probably try to approve them to continue their climb up. And so I do it all the time with guys departing, going southbound. If they're out of my traffic pattern, I have nobody coming inbound, I can see on the radar there's nobody coming inbound, I'm going to tell them delete altitude restriction and climb your discretion, and then switch them. Because they want altitude fast. They don't want to fly at 500 feet. And they got to fly a long way at Edwards at 500 feet just because we keep them out of it. So the best customer service we can provide is letting them climb as soon as possible. All right, I'm going to hold that video where that one was. I have two more to show you here. This brings up two things. One thing being, let's see here, bird strikes and also engine aircraft.
You can watch it here in slow motion. Here the Jaguar is taking off with flame from afterburners coming from its exhaust. As it gains height, a flock of birds is seen. Suddenly, one of the birds enters one of the engines, and the engine flames out with a massive flame coming out from the right engine exhaust. The pilot assesses the situation and does not panic. He jettisons his stores, which fall to the ground and explode in a ball of fire. Once the ball of fire and smoke clear, you can see that the pilot has carried on flying. He turns around later and lands the aircraft safe.
I don't know how common this would be for any aircraft to necessarily jettison their external fuel tanks on departure if they were to lose an engine like that. I'm not sure. This pilot may not even have been aware of whether or not he had one engine out or both engines out. The reason I can think of that he would do this, although there would have to be nobody off the departure, and I don't think one of our aircraft commanders would do that if there is a populated area off the departure end. They would probably actually try to drive the airplane into an area that they can lose the aircraft and then eject. However, in this situation, this pilot must have known that there wasn't anything off the departure end and jettisoned his fuel tanks as fast as possible, because it has to do with weight. They want to get rid of that weight so that he has the chance to attempt to come back to land at the airport. With less weight, he needs less airspeed to stay airborne. So that's going to be the biggest takeaway from that. Here's another one where an aircraft has an issue. I believe he loses his engine here at an air show. And it just shows, again, how fast aircraft, when they lose their engine and they lose that forward thrust, how fast they lose control. And this turns to be a fatal situation.
Thousands of aviation enthusiasts were there to watch the military display. part of the 38th Point Mugu Air Show, northwest of Los Angeles. But the mood soon changed when a low-flying F-4 Phantom jet banked right. There was a sudden burst of flame from the engine when the plane was 60 meters from the ground. The fighter jet veers out of control, then disaster as the plane hits the ground and bursts into flames, claiming the lives of the pilot and his navigator. An amateur cameraman caught the crash on tape.
If you notice, let me back it up a little bit here. You can tell the aircraft, if he lost his right engine, because this is a twin-engine aircraft, the F-4 is. If he lost his right engine, that means his left engine is going to be providing all the thrust, and he's going to have to use his tail to be able to compensate for that, because it's going to want to push it off to the right. I can show you a video later on, too, where an aircraft that wasn't designed to be a single engine, or wasn't designed to be a twin-engine aircraft, was installed with twin engines on it, and the same thing happened, and it became unflyable quickly. And because of his low altitude, you saw what happened here. All right, we're going to close it up. We're going to do one more task, and then we're going to call it a day for that. Aircraft priorities. This is somewhat self-explanatory. You can look these things up. But what I really want to talk about is obviously emergencies. We talk about emergencies being priority. However, at Edwards, we routinely handle emergencies that are not critical. They may have an end-safe light indication. They may have maybe a little bit of smoke in the cockpit, which is a serious condition, but not as serious as losing an engine when you're a single-engine aircraft. And we take them with somewhat of a nonchalance. However, it is important to know that any aircraft that becomes emergency can at any point in time enter a situation where it becomes critical fast. And that's why your trainers are going to be the ones that handle it. Not because you can't tell a guy clear to land because he's an emergency, but because in an instant, things can change and you don't necessarily have the skill yet to be able to accommodate him the best as possible. Now, you might have the skill depending on where you are in training, but it's just not something that the Air Force is going to take any sort of chances with. So within the priorities, there's another one that's special and unique to Edwards Air Force Base I'd like to talk about, and that's Priority Alpha. You probably have never even seen it. It's not something that's used very often. It mostly only happens with high profile cases where there's certain circumstances that they absolutely need. Sometimes we'll have aircraft doing like wet runway testing, or when they do the drag chute testing, where they have to have a certain weight that is critical for their test mission. And so they might request Priority Alpha so that they can go out and then they can say, okay, Tower, I need to come in now. And you have to kick everybody else out of the way in order for them to come in and do their approach. You may send aircraft around. Like if you have a aircraft, you could say that the F-35 might be in the downwind, on an extended downwind, and you have an F-16 maybe on final ahead of him. That's a full stop. And he says, Tower, we're at our weight now, request to turn base. And then I would tell the aircraft short final, if able, go around. Traffic is F-35 conducting a test on base, if we have the chance. It just depends on the scenario. That's not something you can always anticipate. However, whenever Priority Alpha is out there, you need to make sure that we try to accommodate them as best as possible. They're not an emergency aircraft, but they are an aircraft that needs a higher than normal priority for all of our touch and goes, pattern work, full stops even. Priority Alpha is unique in that. We try to accommodate it the best as possible. But that concludes today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a little something. Let me know if you guys want to see something else in the future. Have a good day.